February 1929. The Orient Express sits motionless in Turkey, trapped by deep snowdrifts not far from Istanbul. Hundreds of passengers are stranded as heat falters, supplies run low, and rescue crews fight brutal winter conditions. For days, the myth of effortless luxury nearly collapses. Inside, approximately 300 passengers, including diplomats, aristocrats, and journalists, huddle together as temperatures plummet. Outside, rescue teams struggle through blizzards to reach them. This isn't supposed to happen. Not to the Orient Express. Not to the train that promised effortless luxury across Europe. But for days, nearly a week in some reports, the myth of the Orient Express died in that snowdrift. And then something remarkable happened. The railway company took this disaster, this complete failure of their legendary service, and turned it into romance, into mystery, into legend. This is the true story of the Orient Express disaster they tried to erase from history, and how a near-catastrophe became part of the train's mystique. Before we dive into what happened in that Turkish snowdrift, let me set the stage. Because by 1929, the Orient Express wasn't just a train, it was a symbol, a brand, the gold standard of luxury rail travel. For nearly 50 years, it had been carrying passengers from Paris to Istanbul, crossing an entire continent in comfort and style. The Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, the company that operated the train, had built an empire on the Orient Express reputation, luxury, reliability, sophistication. These weren't just marketing slogans, they were promises. But here's what the company didn't advertise. The Orient Express route crossed some of the most challenging terrain in Europe. The Balkans, the mountains of Bulgaria and Turkey, regions where winter could be brutal, where infrastructure was limited, where a single snowstorm could shut down entire railway lines for days. The company knew this. They'd dealt with winter delays before, but they'd always managed to keep the problems contained, to get passengers through eventually, to maintain the illusion that the Orient Express was unstoppable. But in February 1929, nature had other plans. That winter was one of the harshest on record across Europe and the Middle East. Blizzards swept across the Balkans. Temperatures dropped to levels not seen in decades, and the Orient Express, that symbol of modern luxury and reliability, was about to face its greatest test. A test it would fail spectacularly. A test that would trap hundreds of passengers in conditions that made a mockery of everything the train represented. But here's the twist. This disaster, this complete breakdown of the Orient Express mystique, didn't destroy the train's reputation. Instead, it somehow enhanced it. The story of passengers trapped in the snow became part of the legend, the suffering became romance, the failure became adventure, and the railway company, which had tried desperately to downplay the incident, eventually learned to embrace it. Because it turns out, people don't want perfection, they want stories. And the 1929 snowstorm gave them one hell of a story. Let's go back to February 1929. The Orient Express departed Paris on schedule, carrying approximately 300 passengers. The exact number varies in different accounts, but it was a full train. Diplomats traveling to posts in the Middle East, businessmen heading to Istanbul, wealthy tourists seeking winter sun, and journalists, always journalists, because the Orient Express was news. Anything that happened on the train was worth reporting. The journey started normally, Paris to Strasbourg, Strasbourg to Munich, Munich to Vienna. The train crossed borders smoothly. The dining car served its usual high-quality meals. The sleeping compartments were comfortable. Everything was as it should be. The passengers had no reason to worry. They were on the Orient Express. What could go wrong? The first signs of trouble came in the Balkans. As the train pushed south through Yugoslavia and into Bulgaria, the weather deteriorated. Snow began falling. Not unusual for February, but heavier than expected. The train slowed. Still, it pressed on. The schedule was already delayed, but delays were manageable. The company had dealt with worse. But as the train crossed into Turkey, the situation changed. The snow wasn't just heavy, it was catastrophic. Blizzard conditions, zero visibility, and the wind was creating massive snowdrifts across the tracks. The train pushed through as long as it could, but somewhere near the town of Çerkezköy, about 60 miles west of Istanbul, it finally stopped. The locomotive couldn't push through the snow ahead. The drifts were too deep. The train was stuck. At first, this seemed like a temporary problem. The crew assured passengers that help was coming, that snowplows would clear the track, that they'd be moving again soon. The passengers, while inconvenienced, weren't panicking. They were on the Orient Express. Surely the company would handle this efficiently. But the help didn't come. Not that day, not the next day. The blizzard continued. More snow fell. The drifts grew deeper, and the train, that symbol of modern transportation and luxury, sat motionless, buried, cut off from the world. Now the real problems began. The train's heating system, which relied on steam from the locomotive, began to fail. The coal supply was limited. The crew had to choose between keeping the locomotive ready to move when the tracks were cleared and keeping the passenger cars warm. They chose to conserve coal, which meant the cars grew colder. Passengers bundled in their coats and blankets. The luxury compartments became survival shelters. Food was the next problem. The dining car had supplies for a few days of normal service. But this wasn't normal service. This was 300 people trapped indefinitely. The kitchen staff rationed the food. Meals became smaller, less frequent. The fine dining that was part of the Orient Express experience disappeared. Passengers ate whatever was available, grateful for anything warm. Water became an issue. The train's water tanks were designed for normal operations, not for hundreds of people stranded for days. Drinking water was rationed. Washing became impossible. The toilets, which relied on water systems, began to fail. The elegant sleeping cars started to smell. The veneer of luxury was cracking. And then there was the psychological toll. The passengers didn't know how long they'd be trapped. Communication with the outside world was limited. The crew had no answers. Rumors spread. Some passengers panicked. Others grew angry. The social order that normally governed the Orient Express, the polite distance between first-class passengers and staff, began to break down. Everyone was cold. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was scared. Outside, rescue efforts were underway, but they were hampered by the same blizzard that had trapped the train. Turkish railway workers tried to reach the train with snowplows, but the equipment kept getting stuck. The snow was too deep. The wind kept creating new drifts as fast as they could clear the old ones, and the temperature was dropping. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was becoming dangerous. By the third day, the situation was desperate. The coal was nearly gone. The food was running out. Some passengers were showing signs of hypothermia. The crew was doing everything they could, but they were trapped too. They had no more resources than the passengers. The myth of the Orient Express, the idea that this train could handle anything, was dying in that snowdrift. Finally, on the fifth day, the weather broke. The blizzard stopped. The wind died down, and the rescue teams, which had been struggling for days, finally reached the train. They brought food, water, and coal. They brought snowplows that could actually clear the tracks. And slowly, painfully, they dug the Orient Express out of its frozen tomb. When the train finally limped into Istanbul 5 days late, the passengers were exhausted, cold, and traumatized. This wasn't the elegant arrival the Orient Express promised. This was a disaster, a complete failure of everything the train was supposed to represent. And the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits knew it. This was a public relations nightmare. The most famous train in the world had failed spectacularly. Passengers had suffered. The illusion of effortless luxury had been shattered. The company needed to control the damage. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, do me a favor and hit that like button right now and subscribe, because we've got more hidden railway history coming your way. Trust me, the way this disaster got transformed into legend is even more interesting than the disaster itself. The company's first instinct was to downplay the incident. Official statements emphasized that all passengers had survived, that the crew had done everything possible, that this was an unprecedented weather event, an act of God that no one could have predicted or prevented. They offered compensation to passengers. They promised improvements to winter operations. They tried to move on. But they couldn't control the story, because journalists had been on that train, and they wrote about what had happened. Newspapers across Europe ran stories about the Orient Express, about the failure of the legendary service. The company couldn't erase the disaster. It was public. It was documented. It was part of the historical record. So something interesting happened. Over time, the narrative began to shift. The disaster became an adventure, the suffering became romance, the failure became proof of the Orient Express's legendary status, because only a truly famous train could have a disaster that became a story people wanted to hear. Millions of passengers from different countries and backgrounds coming together in crisis, of the Orient Express crew doing their best under impossible circumstances. Agatha Christie, who had ridden the Orient Express multiple times, was reportedly fascinated by the 1929 incident. While Murder on the Orient Express, published in destroyed the train's reputation, became part of its appeal. The railway company, which had initially tried to downplay the incident, eventually learned to embrace it, not explicitly. They never advertised "Ride the Orient Express and maybe get trapped in a snowstorm," but they stopped trying to erase it from history. They let the story exist. They let it become part of the legend because they realized something important. People didn't want a train that was perfectly reliable. They wanted a train that was legendary. And legends need stories, even stories of failure. This tells us something profound about how myths are created. The Orient Express became legendary not despite its problems, but partly because of them. The 1929 snowstorm, the occasional robberies, the border delays, the political tensions. These weren't bugs in the system. They were features. They were what made the Orient Express more than just transportation. They made it an adventure. Compare this to modern luxury travel. Today's high-end trains and airlines promise perfection. No delays, no problems, everything smooth and efficient. And when something goes wrong, it's a scandal, a failure, something to be apologized for and compensated. We expect perfection, and anything less is unacceptable. But the Orient Express operated in a different era, an era when travel was inherently unpredictable, when crossing Europe meant dealing with different countries, different systems, different challenges. Passengers expected some level of adventure, some level of uncertainty. The company made some practical changes after 1929. They improved their winter operations. They stocked more emergency supplies. They developed better communication systems. They tried to ensure that a disaster like that wouldn't happen again. But they didn't try to erase the memory. They let it exist. They let it become part of the story. And that's the real lesson of the 1929 Orient Express disaster. It's not about the snowstorm itself. It's about how we remember failures, how we tell stories, how we create legends. The Orient Express became legendary not by being perfect, but by being memorable, by having stories worth telling, by surviving challenges and turning them into mythology. Today, when people think of the Orient Express, they think of luxury and mystery and adventure. They think of Agatha Christie novels. They think of elegant dining cars and sleeping compartments. They think of crossing Europe in style. But in failing to erase it, they accidentally created something more valuable. They created a story that enhanced the legend rather than diminishing it. They proved that the Orient Express was more than just a luxury service. It was an experience, an adventure, a journey where anything could happen. And that's why people remember the Orient Express today, nearly 50 years after the last train ran. Not because it was perfect, not because it never failed, but because it had stories, real stories, stories of triumph and disaster, stories of luxury and suffering, stories that proved that the journey mattered as much as the destination. The 1929 snowstorm was a disaster, a complete failure of everything the Orient Express promised, but it became part of the legend, part of the mystique, part of the reason we still talk about the Orient Express today, because sometimes the disasters we try to erase become the stories we remember most. So here's my question for you. Would you rather travel on a train that's perfectly reliable but forgettable, or a train that might trap you in a snowstorm but give you a story you'll tell for the rest of your life? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Orient Express disaster they tried to erase from history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got more hidden railway history coming your way. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best stories come from the worst disasters, and that legends aren't built on perfection, they're built on survival.